and welcome back to the SaaS developer community where we talk about big ideas around building software as a service. And we have here channel favorite Ram, who is CEO of a still stealthy startup. And okay, this episode has a story to it. About a month ago, Ram drew this diagram of how he sees the world of data platforms, and I kind of liked it because it was a unique view. I've never seen it before, and I thought, well, it actually looks cool. There's no company secrets in there. Let me share with other people. It's kind of like everyone else will enjoy it. And I posted it on Twitter, and it became kind of my number one hit from the last, I don't know, a year or something. Like it's just so many likes and retweets, and most of all, people with questions and suggestions and opinions. So I thought I'll invite Ram to the show, first of all, to walk us a bit through his diagram and talk through his thought process. And then I'll just start pulling off questions from Twitter and make sure that he answers all the questions that came up. How is that? Does that sound, Ram?
Sounds great. And thanks for having me. It was exciting to actually see when you shared um, the picture on Twitter, and there was so much opinions and thoughts about it. Um, and it is always good to spend some more time talking about it, our thought process, as well as answer some questions. I think that'll be helpful for most people out there.
You know, when you have opinions about a market that is probably worth trillions, people will feel strongly about the way things were done until now.
Yeah, totally, totally.
Yeah, so let's take a look at the big diagram and basically, how did you even get started? Like, I'm even curious, what circle showed up first?
Yeah, so one of the things that I always strive for is when I build systems, when I try to understand a problem, I really like to understand the 10,000 feet view of, how all these different parts fit together. What's the bigger picture in terms of how things are connected and what are the problems around that? Because, when you try to solve a problem and if you only understand uh, just the space around that problem, oftentimes you'll probably build suboptimal systems and solutions because there are probably other parts of the company using different technologies, having very similar pain points, and you really want to understand the breadth of all the problems and the systems. So obviously when I started this company, and in 1 or 2 months into it, we were trying to understand how does a data platform for a B2B SaaS company uh, would look like, and what problems would it solve. And when you start with such a problem statement, the first thing, and almost very important thing you need to understand, is the lay of the land. But I also think a very critical thing is to understand the user persona, uh, in terms of who are the users and what do they use for and what technologies they use for. And what's fascinating is a persona based view uh, is how you sell, is how you essentially build products for. But oftentimes, when it comes to architectural diagrams and understanding how things work, the persona is kind of left out, right? You assume data architecture of 2020 or 2021 and all these data architecture diagrams that keep floating around, they all assume that this is essentially a standard data architecture that just works for everyone. And it all looks beautiful, beautifully laid out as a sequential set of systems, categorized really really well. It's all the ideal state. But the truth is, unfortunately, that's not the case. The data ecosystem in most of these companies is extremely complex and pretty messy,
Yeah.
and largely because it's not just about the systems themselves, it's also about the different types of people using these systems for different use cases.
So basically, you're saying that the reason that data architectures in real world are always much messier than the nice diagrams that we're used to is not because of technological constraints or because the people who built it were in a hurry or made some trade-offs. It's actually because what is drawn as one system designed by one person for small number of use cases is actually designed by and for a lot of people, and humans are messy.
Yeah, so I think the intersection between systems and the type of humans is what creates a complex ecosystem, right? Not just systems talking to other systems alone. Now, obviously, there are complexities around one system talking to another systems, and you kind of build a complex layer just because of that. But I think the users play a huge role in actually defining and making this whole data ecosystem more complicated and messy.
Because at the end of the day it has to be useful for someone doing something, and if the
Yep,
architecture does not reflect that, you will end up building a different architecture. What choice do you have?
that's right. That's right.
So let's kind of pick an example, one of your circles, and kind of explain maybe how the technology and the people come together in this space.
Yeah. So I mean, in this particular diagram, I started with the primary DB, obviously, because it's the easiest thing, and it has a lot of systems. Even within that, I didn't really focus on enumerating everything. And somebody had also pointed out about the persona for it, but typically, I think that's where most of the things start, right? You finally have to have an application or a product that a company is trying to sell, especially for B2B SaaS, and even true for consumer, where you're trying to like, provide some service. And that's essentially built on a primary database and used by application developers to kind of build their application. They might end up having a few more systems out there, like, a few caches and maybe like a secondary database sometimes for better lookups and so on. But largely, they all fall into the category of, primary DB focus for application developers. Now that's not probably very interesting in this diagram, uh, but if you go slightly above that, and if you look at real-time analytics, now for me that's the category of technologies that all try to solve more or less the same thing, uh, and they all target more or less the same persona. So in this particular case, for me, as much as we want real-time analytics to be many things, from helping with data warehouse use cases, probably to like building real-time applications, to building dashboards and so on and so forth. Largely and primarily, today it gets used by engineers, developers, to build real-time applications that have uh, deep data needs, right? To show data analytics or data insights in your application in real time.
And that
And
means that the requirements for those would be very low latency as opposed to
right, so
what
they
you're
all need
also
low
showing other
latency.
analytics. I guess they are not a good fit because they don't have those latency.
Yeah, I think building a database to be mission critical requires obviously some characteristics around being really low latency, high throughput, and making sure that you can extensively scale that system, and
Exactly.
you
I
can
want to say
trust.
elastic. I mean, that's how we built Kafka in the cloud, right? It's not enough
Right,
to
and
be high throughput at certain scale. You want to actually adjust to different scales.
right, and I think one of the things that's not really appreciated much is uh, about the ease of use to use some of these systems for the target persona. So for example, an app dev uh, have traditionally been very comfortable with using a primary DB, and I find the real-time analytics stores are kind of the closest that comes to attracting the same persona to build these real-time, data-driven applications. And that's kind of what was intended to be presented here, which is, if you look at here, uh, these analytic systems typically read off of a pipeline like Kafka, which is what you see from the primary DB. pushing this data. This could be like CDC, change data capture events, and then they kind of consume that those events and are able to provide APIs, and almost all of these support SQL, uh, and ability to like write analytics queries on top of these systems, which you can then render on your UI to show some kind of visualizations and graphs.
And
Now, I
that is
personally come
mostly
from.
for the engineer persona, right? Because if we go outside that circle to things that have the PM persona, the marketing persona, those no longer look at SQL as a kind of way to work with data.
Yeah, yeah. I think there is two things here, right? One is the PMs typically want their product to become real time, and they want their product to show real time insights. So they are the ones who tend to help prioritize the need for such a use case in your product in the first place. And then your developers are essentially whom they work with to leverage one of these systems to provide that functionality and that experience in their product. So, I was at LinkedIn, and personally, I was obviously, uh, we had a lot of use cases at LinkedIn itself around real time analytics. For example, people who viewed your profile, the insights you see on LinkedIn in terms of all the statistics around your company, and so on and so forth. Now, they're all driven by real time analytics. And, Pino played a huge role in that. I was involved in building real time metrics dashboards for Confluent, and we had one of the world's largest Druid, uh, clusters uh, powered in the cloud to build all these real-time insights in our Confluent applications. I call these applications largely data applications, which are very product focused rather than internal applications. But a lot more use cases around this, especially around SaaS, is going to become more and more popular. This thing about building SaaS data apps, where a lot of these applications become rewritten, being very data focused. Um, I think a real-time analytics uh, product like Rockset, Pinot, Druid, or ClickHouse will play a huge role in that.
So you're saying basically what I'm hearing from you is that you drew all those parts, but it looks like the parts that you see as kind of the highest growth with the most potential at the moment is really the circles that have the developer persona, which is like the primary DB working closely with real-time analytics to power products.
Well, on the developer side, yes, I think these real-time analytics systems and streaming databases, I think will play a huge role in building more real-time applications.
So let me switch over to some of the questions that people asked. The first question, it came up a lot, was really around why persona and not the pipeline views that Anderson Horowitz always show, or those task-based, here's lineage, here's data formats. But I think you actually covered it. It makes sense that if you're thinking about how to how people will use the systems that someone will build, it makes sense to look at the people who will use it.
Yeah, exactly. So I think just to reiterate on that, I think all those architectures are actually great. I think no doubts about it, but it's a gross oversimplification of how the world actually works. It's a lot more complex in reality, and largely because of what I said, which is there are different people, different personas. They are used to different technologies. Some love REST API, some love SQL, some love GraphQL, and so on and so forth. Um, they are used to a lot of tools in the past, and tool ecosystems that they actually like, and they like systems that are well integrated with those tool ecosystems. So what happens is that you end up building a very complex uh, graph of all these different systems talking to each other, and also kind of uh, use cases that come up that you didn't even think of when you build these systems.
Exactly that. I was just thinking there was a discussion on Twitter unrelated to your diagram where I think Josh Wills has said something like, if I had a magical real time updating database, the first thing I will want to do with it is to use it in my test pipeline to make
Mhm.
sure that I cannot deploy to production something that
Mhm.
ends up breaking the data warehouse multiple steps later. And this was extremely relatable.
Right.
And it was like, imagine like we're thinking about real-time data warehouses as an incredibly advanced technology, but the most critical use case is so simple and so
Mhm.
obvious, and only an engineer could come up with this use case. It's not
Yeah, totally.
so that's where like tool chains that cross personas are completely broken. Like an
Mm.
engineer does not get the tools he needs the moment his stuff goes into a data warehouse.
Yep, yep. Agreed.
Yeah, so it definitely makes sense to slice and dice, because then you also know that hey, if a developer needs to work a lot with Salesforce CDP, it may be a bit of a harder time.
Yeah, and I think from a first principles around just product development, you always want to nail your user persona because their expectations around the experience they want, the problems they face, what you're trying to sell, your go-to market, everything will depend on nailing the persona. So
Exactly.
this is
And
also another reason why I wanted to understand how the space works, who's being sold what, who's the buyer, who's the decision maker, who's the user. Oftentimes, these are also very different.
yeah, and
Uh,
there is a lot of just innovation power in saying, I'm going to take a well understood product, but build it for a different persona using their preferences and their habits. It just
yeah,
creates
exactly.
a lot of
Yeah,
innovation.
that's right.
A lot of people pointed out that there is no ETL, there is no ELT, there is nothing that replicates data, except like the errors replicate data, but it can also be produced or consumed or read. So
Yeah.
like it can be a lot of things. Definitely no arrow from the production DB to a data warehouse. And DBT and Fivetran and probably like 500 other companies from the ETL space are completely missing in action. I'm not thinking like it's not an oversight. I'm guessing there was a thought process around it.
Yeah, I mean, I did try to, first off, I did try to cover as much as possible. This was not meant to be exhaustive. The second thing I did want to mention is some of these arrows mean ETL pipeline, some mean just RPC request, and so on and so forth. I have purposefully left it vague, largely because to me that was an implementation detail. I do think in the longer term, what we need as a successful data platform is things that actually completely abstracts the notion of pipelines, managing these pipelines from one point to the other, trying to observe these pipelines and make sure they don't break. Schema evolution across these different pipelines and different personas. I think these are actually hard problems, and I think the solution to all of this is not providing n different SaaS services that can all solve each of these problems and then let the user eventually figure out how to put all these things together to build their data architecture. I think the right approach is to kind of, in the longer term, trying to abstract these things and figure out how the user finally, based on your persona, has a fantastic experience. Um, and that requires them to do less of all these tedious job, even if you're trying to simplify some of this ability to build these pipelines incrementally. I think the true north star here is to kind of completely eliminate the need of pipelines. So
So you're saying
I
that
think that
you did
will
not
happen
draw a
eventually.
pipeline in the picture because you would literally don't want to actually look at the pipeline again. You had enough of those.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been doing pipelines for a long period of time, uh, almost more than a decade, and I do think almost all data problems turn out to be moving bytes from point A to point B,
Exactly. I
right?
used to
And
have in my bio moving data around for 20 years.
yeah, and that's all you do, and still it's still the hardest problem. And I think the challenge has been that we have always tried to solve the problem at the system level instead of at the platform level, right? And I do think to some extent the reason for that is because some of these systems, individual systems, were not mature enough. But now I think they're getting into a state where they're all pretty mature, that I think you can build a much higher abstractions that can simplify a lot of these pipeline models.
And you can kind of see that some of them are trying to go up a bit into different use cases. Yeah, I think you also answered another question that showed up. Shouldn't have Kafka solved all of this? We had this is a messy diagram like the before diagram that LinkedIn used to post, And we've seen the after diagrams that had Kafka in the center and all the lines centralized. But
Yeah.
I think we both know that I don't know a single company where this is the actual reality, that there is no lines going outside of Kafka in different ways.
Yeah, that's exactly right. See that the thing, I think I would also come back to the persona here, right? Which is, if every single persona in the company knew how to use Kafka, and they all were essentially people who understood the APIs and so on and so forth, then you can think of a world where that will work. But the reality is that's not the case, right? A bunch of folks just understand using other SaaS applications.
Yeah,
Like a marketing person will know how to use
that
Marketer.
was what I was thinking. Like we have Rudder Stack in there as like maybe they have a Kafka connector, but there is a good chance that they do not have a Kafka connector. They
Yeah,
probably
exactly.
know
So
how to connect to BigQuery.
yeah, I think almost one thing is for certain, which is every SaaS application is providing, you know, hundreds of integrations with every other SaaS application, right? So
Exactly.
in a way,
And there is companies like Zapier who integrate APIs at like the simplest, like again, like just list of 1,000 different um, Slack and HubSpot and just random connecting random systems is the way I would look at it.
yeah, yeah. So what's happening, I think, is this whole data integration mess that was happening at the data system level is kind of happening at the SaaS level, right?
Exactly.
Which is
Yes.
each SaaS talking to another SaaS and creating this huge mess of, uh, you know, API integration problem, if I have to find a word to define that. And I think that's largely because you're building much higher level abstractions now, where some of them are using Kafka, but the larger problem now is how do you integrate these SaaS services together, or how do you eliminate the need for integrating these SaaS services by building higher level platforms? So
Another question there is you put Airflow with the data warehouse, and yeah, I guess DBT is in there as well. Isn't data workflows its own thing? Like, why is it specific
yeah,
just in the data warehouse?
yeah. I mean, there's no specific thing. I do think data orchestration, especially with Airflow, a large set of use cases I've seen is to deal with, uh, you know, getting this data dumped into the data warehouse and managing that jobs and processes. Now there are obviously systems like, you know, other workflow systems that helps you do, uh, you know, that helps you to like run your services reliably on the application development side. I can see how something like Airflow could also move into that over time, and maybe there are also a few use cases that uses Airflow.
I was
You
thinking
know,
you have
another
a
use.
data lakehouse there. I mean, I'm sure DBT and Airflow are used with data lakehouses.
Yes, yes. So I definitely, I do think they largely get used in those categories. But you know, another example could be like Temporal, which is essentially a workflow system that was largely built. And this is where I think the persona comes into play, which is Temporal is a kind of a system that is used by app developers to kind of build their services and orchestrate their services, largely for service orchestration. And you know, Airflow can be something that could be modeled to support something like that. But I've seen more of that in being leveraged by data engineers to run, um, you know, these data
Yeah.
flows and data processing systems.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just all about the systems you integrate with and what it takes to run it that kind of defines the persona for you. We had a comment from Nick, I cannot pronounce his last name, from Gardner, who said that IT ops and SecOps are very data intensive applications that should have probably been somewhere up there with marketing and PMs as like huge consumers of data.
Yeah, I agree. I think
Yeah,
that that
we just
could
forgot them.
yeah, that could be definitely a category. I think it's a mix of, you know, some of the in some of those verticals, some of these act systems that I mentioned here do get leveraged to solve those use cases. And there are products that also are vertically focused in solving those problems, right? Like, Splunk is a great example, um, and it is definitely worthwhile, making it part of the data architecture.
Yes, Splunk are interesting, right? They started as a very generic, almost like Elastic, just dump all the logs there and we'll do something with them. Maybe the other way around. Elastic started as a bit of Splunk, but then Splunk started specializing in
Yep,
verticals.
yep, yep,
And that was actually very successful, I think. I think they are used a lot in the security vertical today
yep.
after making a lot of money on logs. I'm just saying, like, because there's like people always talk about start narrow and then go into a platform or start platformy and then go into a vertical. But I think you can find successful examples that did both.
Yeah, totally, totally. Yeah, one other thing I want to mention here is data architecture is such an overloaded term right now.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, when most part of the community that I find when they say data architecture, they really focus on data analytics architecture and not necessarily data architecture for a company. I do think it is important that you take into consideration your primary database, your things like your real-time analytics databases, uh, and systems that you're talking about, like Splunk and all of that, are all part of the data architecture that a company has to use to
Yes.
make the business successful. What happens is, at every point in time in the industry, there is a lot of hype for a different set of products. Like, right now, analytics. A few years back, it was all about the primary database, and
Hadoop. I think few years back it was all Hadoop.
yeah, I do. But there's a phase where it is all about Mongo versus Cassandra and so on and so forth. And I do think it's important to. This is why, from my earlier point, it's important to understand the overall ecosystem, and then hopefully not build uh, solutions that actually feel like solving a problem because there's a temporary gap in some parts of your data stack, but you end up creating more problems to other personas in the company by just introducing that new system now. So I think taking all of this in totality, I think, is worthwhile, because I do think future innovations that happen in this space, I hope we can significantly simplify the state of data. Um, and for doing that, I think in some cases you might have to go build vertical SaaS, right? And I think verticalized solutions might be a way to go and simplify the data architecture for some of these um, you know um,
Yeah.
places like e-commerce, or B2B SaaS or fintech and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I was just thinking that because we did not really evolve data architectures into the personas. When data architectures have been around, for many decades, in many ways the personas evolved around data architectures. Like if very early on there was not the split between the production database and the data warehouse, would we
Yeah.
even have data engineers today? Would that exist? And today it's a very, distinguished persona that a lot of companies make good money building products for. So it's
Yeah,
kind
that's a
of
very
funny.
important point. And I think I also want to mention that this also depends, even now, there are many early stage startups who all they have is primary DB, and they just change, they just build roll ups and derive tables in the primary DB to satisfy their analytics needs. And then, most of the stuff that we're talking about here is an evolution of a company eventually once they get into the enterprise stage or a pretty large company, ending up with a lot of different personas and complex data needs.
Yeah, many years ago, Exadata, the Oracle hardware software thing, was supposed to allow you, because of a bunch of technical innovations, to actually run real data warehouses and applications on the same database. I'm still a lot skeptical. Like, yes, when you have your startup and all you have is 2,000 rows, then of course everything is easy. I'm still not sure it's feasible to physically run them together. I think And I think that's something you said around this architecture. Like
Yeah, I think that's what
it's
I feel
about
like.
abstracting the hardware and those implementation details away.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the difference between systems and platforms to me.
Yeah.
I think platforms can solve that problem. Systems should be built for one use case, and it should work really well for that use case.
Yes. We had a mention from Roxette that we forgot to put them on the real-time analytics box. We have now corrected it. And they also wanted to point out that real-time analytics is great for data applications. And I believe we have discussed data applications in the beginning. So uh, we
Oh, I totally
apologize for
agree.
this miss.
Yeah, so I think I just wanted to show this difference a bit here. If you see what I've done here is I have something like customer on the right, then I have a product. Okay, so this is kind of like the external consumer application or your SaaS application and so on. And to me, data apps, it's a kind of again a very overloaded, unclear terminology. But a lot of when they say data apps, they also mean building internal apps for some person or internally inside a company to build some data dashboards,
Yeah.
which I think is a very important use case, and
But
I think
it's
you should.
not new, right? We had the blow for many years now. I mean, it's just
Yeah,
you
yeah,
don't even need a new term to say, "Oh yeah, we have a dashboard."
that's right, that's right. But I do think I know the connection that I made with real-time analytics to the product uh, is kind of how I do think external products that are data centric, you can call them as SaaS data apps, consumer data apps, and so on, are kind of built. And I still think uh, to build external mission critical applications which customers eventually leverage and use, you need mission critical systems that have low latency, that can have really high availability, and high throughput. And the systems that I have on the right are largely focused on that, versus the ones on the left. So
Yeah, and I mean,
it'll
now
be
that I'm
interesting.
thinking about it, things like Datadog and New Relic and Honeycomb and all those, they are data apps in a sense.
Correct. They're all data apps. Exactly. They're all data apps. And they all end up having to build or leverage one of these systems on the right, like your real-time analytics stores or your primary database and a combination of Kafka and so on, to kind of build out their data apps. I think it still is very complicated, because oftentimes what you want is you also want to take this data from your warehouse, uh, which you have valid use cases for, right? Like if you're really processing some historical data, uh, uh, or you're trying to process some data that only is in the warehouse, you might have to bring that data back into your serving tier to serve that. And that space is not really well defined yet in terms of how do you do that. And also, the one other thing that's happening is the evolution of the real-time analytics side of the world, and the data warehouse and data lake side of the world. It'll be very interesting to see where they overlap. I definitely think the personas are very different today, with
Yes.
data engineers and data people versus the app developers. Uh, but I do think there are a lot of um, possibilities that these systems can eventually converge, or the real-time analytics space can take up a lot of use cases.
Yeah.
So it's something
Absolutely.
which worthwhile watching. But still, I mean, they're all complex to deal with. I do think building good platforms that abstracts all these details for the end customer or users is kind of the probably like the next phase of innovation in the data
Yeah,
space.
and again, we are focusing on persona. The main thing is that there are developers building applications that need access to the application at incredibly low latency, to the data at incredible latency, so they can use it in the application to show their customers. And last week we had on the show Laura, and I asked her the hardest problem for driving growth to her platform. And she said, well, we need to target very specific people at a very specific point in time. So we really want to have the right pop up for people who signed up to the what viewed this screen that much time ago, and then and have at least that much throughput, pay at least that much money,
Right,
and
right,
did not use this kind of thing in the last n days. And he's like, okay, half of the data is in production database, half of it is somewhere in segment, half of it is in my data warehouse. We don't have a data lake, otherwise the other half would probably be in a data lake. But it's like, and remember, she's leading a team of front end engineers. How in the world is her team going to solve that? Is a
yeah,
fascinating question.
yep,
Um, so yeah, there was also a question around what is the primary DB persona. I want to point out that it should be fairly obvious. It was obvious to us that application developers are the only ones who are allowed to touch the production database. And even that they don't really touch it directly all that much. Their application is the thing that really touches it, usually millions of times a second. This is what defines transactional databases. Yeah, and I think we're done with questions from the internet.
awesome. Yeah, I think hopefully this was useful. I do think it's going to be interesting to see how the space evolves. A lot of the things that we are trying to build here, and is kind of trying to solve some of these problems. Um, and we think there's lots of potential for to kind of tackle these challenges. But I do think it'll be nice to do a refresh of this space after a year to see how things are.
Oh, I'm going to create a note in my to-do list, in my calendar for a year from now. Uh, People who watch this and are actually excited to try a new way of interacting with data, should they ping us and say, hey, I want to perhaps be
Yeah,
an
yeah, totally.
early design partner of an innovative new platform?
Yeah, yeah. I think we can do that. Send it out and mention that. I don't know. I think we'll see if somebody comes back and are interested. If they come and if they're interested, definitely.
So yeah, click the link below if you're interested. Um, so thank you very much for your time. As
Yeah.
always,
No.
I feel smarter having listened.
Thank you. Take care.